Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we are back today for episode 11 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to dive into this year's quarterback class, as we are less than 2 weeks until the NFL draft here in Detroit, and this is a big-time quarterback class. We'll probably see at least 4 first-round picks of this group, potentially up to 6, so this is a very important group for your Dynasty rookie drafts. If you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Amazon, pretty much any platform out there. If you can find podcasts there, we are on it. So go ahead and give us a follow on your platform of choice. Leave us a 5-star review and give us a follow on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. Ask us questions, interact with us there. We're happy to answer questions and interact and talk about trades, whatever it is you want to do. We're on Twitter, so go find us there. And subscribe on YouTube as well at Dynasty War Room. But we're just going to jump into things. There isn't a whole lot of lead-in required for this episode because the quarterback episode is pretty straightforward. This is not going to be as long of a show as last week, because there are simply not enough players that are worth talking about in terms of a 4, even a 5-round rookie draft. So we have 7 players up for today, broken into 4 different tiers, and we'll start with number 1, and that is Caleb Williams. He's in a tier all by himself, and he's the projected 101 in the NFL draft to the Chicago Bears out of USC. He's 21.3 years old and comes in at 6'1", 214 pounds. This past season, he was very good. It was a bit of a down year, wasn't quite as good as his 2022 season, but his last season stats in 2023, 268 completions, 394 attempts. That's a 68% completion percentage. 3,647 yards, 30 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. He had a 90.3 PFF offensive grade. And then when it comes to rushing, we've gone through and broken down the stats to get rid of sack yardage. College stats are typically kept with negative yards for sacks, whereas in the NFL, that's not the case. So we've gone and weeded those out. So just purely from scrambling and designed rushing attempts, Caleb Williams had 74 carries for 356 yards, and 24 of those carries and 207 of those yards came on scrambles. He also scored 11 touchdowns on the ground. So, big-time athlete. He can get it done on the ground or through the air. He's probably not going to be somebody that runs for 50, 60 yards a game in the NFL. That's just not the type of player he is, but he will have a nice floor in the NFL, given that he probably can rush for 20 to 30 yards per game, which, in fantasy, that's a nice, 2 or 3 point boost every single game. So that's always really nice to see. He'll be an elite quarterback, regardless of whether it's a 4-point touchdown, passing touchdown league, or a 5 or 6 point passing touchdown league. There's not a lot of negatives to say about Caleb Williams. So we'll start there. There's really only a couple small things. Number 1 is fumbles. He fumbled way too much last year. He had 16 of them. And he struggled in the bigger games that USC had. I think a lot of people like to point to the game against Notre Dame, where he struggled mightily. And, it was a team that obviously wasn't all that successful, didn't make the college football playoff, didn't end up in a New Year's Six bowl game, didn't win the conference. So, certainly a tough year from that standpoint in terms of winning, but having a defense as bad as USC had last year certainly does not help in that regard. But Caleb Williams is the consensus 101 in Superflex Dynasty drafts. He's, there will be some people that choose to take Marvin Harrison over him. Probably those people that either really don't believe in Caleb Williams, or if they have a really bad need for a receiver, that's certainly an option. I think in 8 or 10 person leagues, that's when you can get away with taking a wide receiver ahead of Caleb Williams. But in a 12 or 14 team Superflex, particularly in what is considered standard, a 12 team league, Caleb Williams probably should be the consensus 101 regardless. I really don't know that there's a great argument for taking Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors or anybody else, given the fact that the position is so important in a 12-team or larger league. And in Superflex leagues, it's just, you need 2, 3, 4 quarterbacks that are all startable on your roster. So, he should be a star. I mean, that is what he's being billed as. He's walking into an incredible situation in Chicago where he's going to have DJ Moore, he's going to have Keenan Allen, Cole Kmet at tight end. They just signed DeAndre Swift at the running back position, and they have a stable of other backs as well that can pitch in, whether it be Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson. So, an improving offensive line. This is a up-and-coming team in Chicago, and it's a unique situation, of course, in that, the Bears were not as bad as a typical team that has a number 1 overall pick because it's actually the Panthers pick. So, one of the better situations in recent memory for a first overall pick. And in terms of a play style, this is somebody that, and we've talked about Caleb Williams a little bit before on previous rookie shows, but essentially, this is somebody that is just an elite playmaker. He can extend plays. He is a good player at avoiding sacks and getting the ball downfield. He can scramble when need be. He kind of has a Aaron Rodgers, Pat Mahomes style of play. I don't throw around those names lightly. I'm not saying he's going to be as good as those two players, but in terms of just stylistically, I think with some of the rushing and the run around and make things happen, that is the type of player that Caleb Williams is. So I think that is how I see his style of play, and he certainly has the ceiling to be, of that caliber of player. Obviously, you never really know if rookies will hit. The quarterback position in general is a very difficult position to predict, especially for fantasy analysts that, we don't get to talk to players. We don't get to sit in on the interviews. We don't know what kind of work ethic these guys have. But purely from an athletic standpoint and statistical production, he meets, everything there is. He checks every box, and he's still very young. So lots to like about Caleb Williams. He's the easy number 1 overall pick in your Superflex rookie drafts. Now, things get more interesting with picks 2, 3, and 4. I think essentially everyone agrees that it's Jaden Daniels, JJ McCarthy, Drake May in some order. The question is, what exactly is the order? Now, draft capital will help somewhat with these players, especially if one ends up sliding out of the top 5. But if all 3 of these guys end up in the top 5 or 6 picks, that's where things, stay a bit cloudy. So I have all 3 of these players in the same tier. So tier 2 at quarterback. But I do have Jaden Daniels ranked at number 2 right now. So, and as is the case with every other player on this list, but especially within this tier where, I think the ceiling is very high for all 3. I think all 3 are very good prospects, but they do definitely have some cons. So we're going to walk through the pros and cons of each of these guys. But first up, let's get through the statistics from this past season. Jaden Daniels out of LSU, he's projected to be a top 5 pick. He is 23.3 years old. He stands at 6'3", 210 pounds. And last season, where he won the Heisman Trophy, 236 for 332 for a 71.1% completion percentage, 3,811 yards, 40 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. He had a 94.7 PFF offense grade. And in terms of running the ball, we'll break it down the same way we did with Caleb Williams. So again, we've already weeded out the sacks, and Jaden Daniels takes a lot of sacks. That's one of his negatives. So 120 carries, 1,250 yards, and 10 touchdowns. 55 of those attempts came on scrambles, and that equaled 721 yards. So whether it's a designed run or scrambling on a broken down play, Jaden Daniels very good on the ground, and that's really what separates him as a prospect for fantasy football. If I was an NFL general manager, I'm probably not taking Jaden Daniels over either of JJ McCarthy or Drake May. But from a fantasy perspective, he checks all the boxes. He is a dual threat guy. He can really kind of blow the game up with his rushing upside. I mean, this is somebody that, we all saw the excitement with Justin Fields and what he could have been. if he could have just been a league average passer. Look at Lamar Jackson. I don't think anybody looks at Lamar Jackson and says he's a top 3 passing quarterback in the NFL, but he's an elite runner, and he's an above average passer, and he's the MVP. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. So, and he's great for fantasy, which is the same sort of argument you can make for Jaden Daniels. So there are negatives. First is his age. He's over 20. He's 23 years old, and he played 5 years in college. He was not good at Arizona State, where he started his career. Transferred after 3 years to LSU, where he had a solid 4th season, and then just exploded as a 5th-year senior, winning the Heisman Trophy. So he has a lot of experience. So that is good in that sense that, he's seen the field. He started all 5 years. He did start as a true freshman at Arizona State, so that does say something about him as a prospect. And he got better every year. So if you're going to be a senior or a 5th-year senior and have played a whole bunch of college football, we do obviously want to see you as a player get better every single year. So I don't know if he is going to be quite, the Lamar Jackson level of NFL player. I don't know if I see that, but I think he can be somewhere between Justin Fields and Lamar Jackson. So in that sense, from a fantasy perspective, like we saw with Justin Fields, when he was healthy and playing, he was a top 10 fantasy quarterback in points per game each of the last 2 seasons. I mean, great for fantasy because he can run the ball, solid enough throwing. He's going to have weapons. And Jaden Daniels is right now projected to go 2nd overall to the Washington Commanders, where he'll have some decent receivers. He's going to have Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, and he'll have a pass-catching running back with Austin Eckler, Brian Robinson. Not the pass-catching guy, but he'll obviously carry the load on first and second down, for that team. So a solid group. There are certainly worse places to be than the Commanders as a quarterback coming in to the NFL. Cliff Kingsbury at OC did good things in terms of fantasy with Kyler Murray in Arizona. Obviously didn't work out in terms of NFL success, but Kyler Murray's been a really good fantasy quarterback. I think you could see similar type of production from Jaden Daniels if that is where he goes. And, sure, he played with some really good weapons at LSU, but I don't think that's something that I want to hold against him. We've seen plenty of quarterbacks over the years have, high-level receivers in college, and it doesn't affect their performance one way or the other in the NFL. I mean, look at C.J. Stroud. He had incredible weapons at Ohio State, and he carried that right over to the NFL. So Jaden Daniels, because of that rushing upside, is my QB2. Factoring in the fact that he's likely to go 2nd overall, I think that certainly helps because it means that an NFL team looked and had their choice at all the other quarterbacks and still went with Jaden Daniels despite the fact that he was a 5th-year senior and despite the fact that he was kind of a late bloomer and really was a 1-year wonder type of player. So in that sense, I don't typically like going for guys that are older and broke out late and really have only one, elite year of college production. But the rushing upside is so important that it kind of overrules everything else that's a negative about Jaden Daniels. Now, next up at number 3, this is where I go away from consensus. I have J.J. McCarthy at number 3. He's out of Michigan, projected to be a top 10 pick. He is 21.2 years old. He's 6'3", 219 pounds, which is a nice weight level. I think he played at less than that, but he did put on about 15 or so pounds leading up to the combine. So that was good to see. And this is a guy that last year obviously won the national title at Michigan, and he wasn't asked to do a ton. But when he was asked to make big plays, he was very good. So last season for Michigan, J.J. McCarthy, 240 for 333. That's good for a 72.1 completion percentage. 2,991 yards, 22 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. He had a 90.6 PFF offense grade. And on the ground, he had 57 attempts for 340 yards and 3 touchdowns. 18 of those carries were scrambles, and that resulted in 168 yards. So J.J. McCarthy is someone that has the arm talent. He threw the ball the second hardest at the NFL Combine. He is an elite mid-range thrower, just really strong accuracy over the middle of the field and to the right side of the field. He does struggle a little bit throwing the ball to his left, but in terms of 10 to 19 yards down the field, very good passer in that range. He does have some mobility. He's not going to run anywhere near to the Jaden Daniels level and probably not even to Drake May's level, but he certainly has that capability. I think you probably get that same type of floor that you'd be looking at with Caleb Williams on the ground. So something like 30 yards per game rushing. And that's, again, 3 extra points in fantasy. That's a big deal. So he's someone that, in terms of negatives, obviously we don't have quite the level of production that we would love to see in terms of having 500 attempts or even 400 attempts or anything. He doesn't have the body of work that Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, any of these guys had in college, because Michigan didn't ask him to throw the ball 450 times a year, or even close to it. 450 is a bit of an exaggeration because, as we just talked about, Caleb Williams was at 394. Jaden Daniels and J.J. McCarthy actually threw the ball essentially the same number of times last year. It was guys like Drake May and Michael Penix, Bo Nix, that all threw it considerably more. But J.J. McCarthy played in a run-first, pro-style offense, and I do think it's important to emphasize the fact that it was a pro-style offense, and J.J. McCarthy was very good on third down. When this team was in a situation where, they needed a play, and it was third and long, third and medium, more times than not, he succeeded on that play, and what more can you ask for? I mean, you want a quarterback that can make the right throw, be accurate, avoid sacks, and make big plays when they are required, and that's what he did. He is prone to some risky throws. Every now and then he'll make a decision where you kind of go, oh man, you probably should have just thrown that away. An example of that, I think, could be the very first offensive play of the Rose Bowl against Bama, where threw the ball, was picked off, but fortunately for Michigan, the Alabama player had stepped out of bounds. So, situations like that where something is just not there. He only had 4 interceptions, so of course this doesn't happen a lot, but every now and then you will see some throws where you're like, play it a little bit safer. So there is a little bit of a gunslinger mentality with McCarthy that I don't think a lot of non-Michigan fans realize is there. But he's not afraid to throw the ball down the field, try to fit the ball into tight windows. But I think, as we saw, his accuracy is really, really strong. So that enabled him to make those tough throws. We saw a lot of those throughout the season, threading the needle. So I think in terms of, safety as an NFL prospect, while he doesn't have the huge statistical numbers as, we've seen in the past from first-round picks, I think that J.J. McCarthy actually might be the safest quarterback in this draft outside of Caleb Williams. I think Jaden Daniels has some things that could certainly, turn him into a bust at the NFL level. We talked about the age and the, 1-year wonder, and he relies on his rushing a lot. And certainly he had great passing numbers, but, he takes a lot of big hits. J.J. McCarthy does a pretty good job protecting himself. I think he's a very skilled passer. He's, we can get into all the off-the-field stuff with J.J. McCarthy. That's great. Obviously, he's a winner. Won the national title. Just was incredible. Big Ten champion all 3 years at Michigan. 3-0 against Ohio State. But I just think he has some safety to him. I don't really see J.J. McCarthy as somebody that's going to be this colossal bust in the NFL. Is his ceiling as high for fantasy football as somebody like Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams? No. And that's why I have him at 3 and not anywhere higher. But I think this could be a good value in your rookie drafts. I think that the majority of people will probably have Drake May ahead of him. And certainly if Drake May gets drafted above J.J. McCarthy, I would expect the consensus would be that Drake May is above McCarthy. So just something to keep an eye on. I think if you're somebody in that 5 or 6 range of your rookie draft, if J.J. McCarthy goes 4th, 5th overall to the Minnesota Vikings in a trade, he's going to be a very popular pick, I think, in that 5 to 7 range. I think you'll probably see him jump Brock Bowers. You could even potentially see a situation where he's being taken over Rome Odunze in rookie drafts. So again, that's where landing spot will matter. If he ends up anywhere else other than Minnesota, I think if he goes to New York at 6 or New England at 3 or something like that, I don't know that we'll see the jump in ADP like we might if he goes to what is perceived as a better landing spot with Minnesota. But as it stands right now, sort of regardless of landing spot, just from a more general perspective, I think if you are in that range and you want to trade back 1 or 2 spots, from 6 to 8 or, 4 to 6, 5 to 7, something along those lines, I think there's a pretty clear top 8 in rookie drafts right now. And it all depends who you ask, whether it's, JJ McCarthy at 8 or Brock Bowers at 8 or, Drake May, whatever the situation may be. I think there's a lot of mixed opinions. So get a feel for your league, take a look at needs, get a, feel for who you think they might like, and use that to your advantage when it comes to maneuvering within your drafts. But JJ McCarthy right now for me is at number 3 in my pre-draft rankings. And at number 4, I do have Drake May, so this rounds out tier number 2. Drake May out of North Carolina, also projected to go in the top 5. He's 21.6 years old, stands at 6'4", 223 pounds. Last season with North Carolina, 269 for 425. That's a 63.3 completion percentage. 3,608 yards, 24 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. He had a 90.8 PFF offensive grade. And running the ball, 92 carries, 582 yards, and 9 touchdowns. 51 of those carries were scrambles and resulted in 415 yards. So a good majority of his rushing yards did come on scrambles, 415 out of his 582, despite being pretty close in terms of designed runs versus scrambles. So Drake May does have a rushing floor, and that is certainly good from a fantasy perspective. And it's kind of why I really like this draft class from a fantasy perspective. Obviously, in the NFL, quarterbacks bust in the first round at a pretty frequent rate. I believe it's like essentially a roughly 50-50 shot, whether a player is a hit or a bust at the quarterback position in the first round. So definitely some risk at the position. But in terms of fantasy football, we got a top 4 group that all can run the ball. Every single one of these guys, you should be able to count on at least, 25 to 35 rushing yards per game. And that's a nice floor to have. I think Jaden Daniels are probably going to see a lot more than that. I think Drake May, you could be looking at certainly more than that as well, given his numbers at North Carolina. So there is certainly some nice things with Drake May from a rushing standpoint. We really like that. I talked about it at length with Jaden Daniels. I won't rehash everything about how important it is, but that does give him a nice floor. So the reason that I have him at 4 and not at 3 ahead of McCarthy, which is a bit of a change, and you can call it prospect fatigue or whatever you want to say, but Drake May has some things as a passer that does scare me. But at the same time, he is a very boom-bust prospect because some of the things that he struggles with, like accuracy and footwork in the pocket, there have been other quarterbacks in the past that struggled with things like this. Josh Allen was not an accurate quarterback coming into the NFL, and the Dynasty community didn't love him because of it. And it turned out, well, he figured it out enough to be the number 1 overall fantasy quarterback. So Drake May has a ceiling that could see him being that type of quarterback. I think everyone in the world has seen comps to Justin Herbert. So there's, being 6'4", 223 pounds, he's got the size, he's got the arm strength, some of the things that you want from your quarterback prospects that, you can't teach. However, there were some concerns throwing the ball. I didn't necessarily see a truly elite passer. He struggled with some interceptions. He had 9 of them this year, and he finished the year relatively poorly as well in probably their 3 biggest games of the season. Against Duke, Clemson, and North Carolina, he finished with 4 touchdowns to 4 interceptions total across those 3 games. And it's not like Drake May really had a history of playing against elite defenses in the ACC. This similar to, Caleb Williams and Michael Penix and, Bo Nix in the Pac-12. The ACC is not necessarily known for strong defenses. So, that is certainly unfortunate in terms of a prospect and being able to scout him and see, well, okay, how's he hold up against, Big Ten or SEC defenses like we were able to see with J.J. McCarthy and Jaden Daniels. But even, with holding that and not really holding that against him, he just didn't blow me away. There are certainly some concerns with accuracy in my mind, and the footwork I think has been talked about a lot in the Dynasty space already. But this is somebody that I think there is a little bit of prospect fatigue with, because he was talked about last year as being, the number 2 pick behind Caleb Daniels, and throughout the season he was kind of still thought of that way. And I think that some people want to put him lower just for the sake of being different, which I think falls into more of that fatigue category. But I think at the same time, a lot of people just assumed that he would stay number 2 because that's what he was last year. But I think as we've been able to dig into things a little bit more, we see that, his 2023 season was not as good as his 2022 season. And sure, there are reasons for that. The offensive system changed at North Carolina. They went to a more pro-style attack. So in that sense, it's probably good for his development to get some of that out of the way in college, as opposed to having to do that as a rookie in the NFL. But there are some concerns here too. This could be just another quarterback that, has the right build, but can't figure it out from a processing and accuracy standpoint in the NFL. So very high ceiling. You could even make the case that Drake May has a higher ceiling than J.J. McCarthy because his rushing floor is a little bit higher. And he does, he is a little bit bigger, not by a lot, but, a little bit bigger, kind of the more prototypical NFL prospect. But I think he is a very safe number 4 in this draft in terms of, where you'd want to rank him. I think I'm being a bit conservative having him this low. But he's in the same tier as McCarthy and Daniels, and he's going to be a top 10 pick, and he should have a nice NFL career. And I would not shy away from taking him in the middle of the first round in rookie drafts. I think right now my position is that I would take Malik Neighbors ahead of all 3 of these quarterbacks. And I certainly think that there's an argument to Rome Odunze over these 3 quarterbacks and potentially Brock Bowers. But that's, I think, when we finally nail down the exact order that we would like to see within the top 8. We're not going to be able to do that until post NFL draft, because landing spot will matter. If one of these guys falls to, 12 or 13, or, Rome Odunze ends up in a worse landing spot or a better landing spot, whatever the case may be, a lot of these questions about an exact order we won't know until post NFL draft. But as of right now, I think Drake May in most rookie drafts is going somewhere around the 5th or 6th pick, just depending on personal preferences and, again, how people see the prospects at the other positions. Now, moving on to tier number 3, which is a 2-man tier, and it's Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix. So Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington and Indiana before that. His draft capital is a huge question and is going to make a big difference in terms of where he goes in a rookie draft. But he's kind of being projected at that 1-2 turn in the NFL draft. He's 23.9 years old, so definitely on the older side. We don't love that. He played a long time in college, 6 years, and he's 6'2", 216 pounds. Last season with Washington, where they made the national title game, 364 completions, 556 attempts. That's a 65.5 completion percentage, 4,906 passing yards, 36 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, a 91.1 PFF offense grade. And he didn't run the ball. 41 attempts for 80 yards and 3 touchdowns. 8 of those rushes came on scrambles for 48 yards. So while he didn't run the ball, he didn't scramble. I think there are some reasons for that. He was elite at avoiding sacks, number 1. So he wasn't in a position where, he had a poor offensive line or anything like that where he needed to run around a bit. He had a really, really, really good offensive line, And he had a lot of injury history. He suffered major injuries every single season at Indiana. Both knees, his shoulder. So some concern there on an injury front. It sounds like his medicals have checked out heading into the NFL. So that's certainly a good sign. And just because he didn't run doesn't mean he is unable to. He was more of a dual threat quarterback at Indiana, and he still is very athletic. We saw at his pro day, he had some really nice testing numbers. I think he just doesn't run as much because of his injury history and the fact that he just didn't need to because his O-line was so good. He had elite wide receivers, and the scheme at Washington protected that to where he, just a really good offense all the way around up there in Washington. So I like Michael Penix a lot. I do worry a little bit about, the fact that he doesn't really have a rushing floor in terms of fantasy production. I think he's somebody that maybe has a chance of being a better NFL quarterback than a fantasy quarterback. And whether he goes in the first round is going to be a big difference in terms of how he will be valued in your drafts. If he sneaks into the first round, it's one thing if he goes in the teens. If he ends up with the Raiders or the Broncos or something in the teens, I think that is a huge boost to his value, and I think you will see he'll be going in the first round of rookie drafts. The back four picks, but he'll still be going in that range. However, if he goes in the second round, or even if he goes at the very back of the first round, a team trades up to pick, 30 or something like that and takes him there to get that fifth-year option, or if he goes in the first handful of picks in the second round, I do think you're probably still looking at more of an early second-round pick. In rookie drafts, maybe the 201 to 203 type of range. And you can say the same thing. This all applies as well to Bo Nix. Same exact type of scenario. If he goes in the teens, he'll be a first-round pick somewhere in that 9 to 12 range. But if he goes in the second round, again, you're probably looking at a second-round dynasty pick. So just something to keep in mind in terms of draft capital leading into the NFL draft. It's going to matter a ton for guys like Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix. But good deep ball thrower, just a very good quarterback, good processor. He's got a ton of experience. He took over the starting job as a freshman at IU and certainly, had it, of course, at Washington for both years he was there, was in the Heisman race. So very good passer. I'd worry a little bit. He certainly will throw interceptions. He had 11 of them. When you throw the ball 556 times, it's bound to be that your numbers are a little bit higher in that category. But he's just somebody that you kind of have to be a little cautious about. The landing spot, I think, will matter a lot if he goes to a team where, he doesn't have any weapons and doesn't have a running game or a good offensive line. Like, he's a type of quarterback that I think needs to step into a situation kind of like what we see with Jared Goff in Detroit, where, okay, Goff maybe isn't good enough on his own to lift the entire team, but you put him on a team with good weapons, good offensive line, and you don't ask him to, do too much, he can really thrive. So that's kind of the same scenario that I see for Michael Penix, and I hope he ends up in a scenario where he does get weapons, and isn't just left hanging out to dry in the NFL. Next up at number 6 is Bo Nix, and he comes out of Oregon by way of Auburn. And again, same sort of deal with Penix, where first, second round pick just depends on, how things go on draft night. I think the earliest he'd be taken is probably in that Vegas and Denver range in the teens, but could very well fall into the mid-second as well. So keep that in mind. 24.1 years old. He's 6'2", 214 pounds. And last season with Oregon, 361 completions, 467 attempts. So really strong completion percentage, 77.3. 4,454 yards, 45 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions. He had a 93.0 PFF offense grade. And on the ground, 55 carries for 256 yards and 6 touchdowns. 21 of those carries were on scrambles for 162 yards. So there are some similarities both to Michael Penix in terms of being in college, for a long time and his age, and moving to a conference where the defenses weren't as strong. But some of the bigger differences are Bo Nix was actually not that good when he was at Auburn, whereas Michael Penix Jr. was great at Indiana. He's kind of similar to Jaden Daniels in that regard, where, not that great at his previous stop. But just like Jaden Daniels, he did get better every single year. He improved. He has a lot of experience. So there are some things to like about Bo Nix. However, I see him more of a mid-second round rookie pick, and I think it's going to take a good scenario for him, just like it would for Penix. And the Oregon offense is a little bit tricky to evaluate because we've seen over the years that it's kind of a Mickey Mouse offense. They kind of fool you a little bit. It's not really it's not a pro style offense. It's not something where you feel great about the offensive weapons coming out year after year. And so that's just something to be aware of. I think that's why you see the completion percentage so high. A lot of screen passes, short things to just get the ball in the hands of his weapons. Obviously, a 45-3 touchdown to interception ratio is insane and is very impressive. So there certainly are some very nice things out there from a statistical standpoint for Bo Nix. I just don't know that I see it translating quite as well because Bo Nix doesn't have the rushing upside to somebody like Jaden Daniels. So even though his passing, shows up on a stat sheet, he doesn't have that game-breaking ability that somebody like Daniels have to, separate himself from a fantasy football perspective, which, we have to remember that's what we're evaluating here. We're not just saying, who's a better passer or who's going to, last longer in the NFL. It's who's going to be better for fantasy football, who can you plug into your lineup and, count on for 20-point games and, that sort of thing. So I don't really see Bo Nix as that type of guy, but, lower end NFL starter or, potential career high end backup, something along those lines is probably where he fits in. The promise and the upside of a starting quarterback in the NFL is certainly worth a shot in the second round of your rookie draft. Now, last but not least is Spencer Rattler coming in at number 7, and he's in a tier of his own, tier 4. He transferred to South Carolina, where he finished his career from Oklahoma, and he's projected right now to go in the 3rd round of the NFL draft, and he's 23.5 years old, 6 foot, 211 pounds, solid but not spectacular numbers at South Carolina last year, 274 for 403, 68.0 completion percentage, 3,183 yards for 19 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. But he had a 77.6 PFF offensive grade and 67 carries for 371 yards and 4 touchdowns, 39 of which were scrambles for 337 yards. So again, another situation there where essentially all of his rushing yards came on scrambles. And Spencer Rattler, there are some people that I think can see him going in the 2nd round, and maybe that changes things a bit to push him into being like a 3rd round rookie pick, depending on the team he goes to. I just don't see a scenario where he's going to be looked at as the starter of the future on a team, which is why I do think, 3rd round in the NFL draft probably makes a little bit more sense. And in terms of a rookie draft, if you want to throw something at him in the 4th round, go for it. You never know what you might get. Day 2 is certainly something that you'd want to see for him in terms of draft capital if he falls into the 4th. Or later, that's, the chances of him ever being anything more than a backup are essentially 0. But if he goes in the 2nd or 3rd round, there's a decent possibility that he'll end up starting a handful of games here or there, depending on what team he goes to. But that's just where you have to be aware of the scenario. If he goes to a team like the Seahawks, where, Geno might be there for a year, and then they're looking at, somebody like Rattler coming in and taking over, that's probably a better scenario than if he ends up on, I think I've seen the Rams mocked a lot for Rattler, where, Stafford's probably still going to be there for a few years. It's going to be Stafford's job until he decides to retire. And if he's there for more than another season or two, by the time it gets around to the point where, they would move on to somebody else, it's not going to be Rattler's job. It will be a rookie. It'll be a different NFL vet. So I see Rattler as more of a career backup. I don't think he's particularly athletic. So I just don't see it there for him. He had all the hype a few years ago at Oklahoma as, oh, this guy could be first overall pick. That obviously didn't work out. So it is nice for him to be able to still get a shot at the NFL and be a mid-round pick. But from a fantasy perspective, I just don't think he's going to have a lot of value to you as a dynasty manager. So that's it for today's episode. That's 7 different quarterbacks that we've gone, in depth on here. And just to repeat this back, Caleb Williams at number 1 in a tier of his own, Jaden Daniels at 2, JJ McCarthy at 3, Drake May at 4, all 3 of those players in the same tier. And then in tier number 3, we have Michael Penix Jr. at number 5 and Bo Nix at number 6, and then Spencer Rattler rounding it out at number 7 in a tier of his own. There will be some other quarterbacks that get taken in this draft, probably on day 3. I don't think that's really worth paying any attention to from a rookie dynasty draft standpoint. If you want to throw a couple bucks of fab on somebody, or you could probably get them without putting anything. But if there's a later round quarterback that you just really like, or you like the situation, or is drafted to be the backup for one of your starters on a Superflex team, go for it. Pick them up off of waivers, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend burning a draft pick on any other quarterbacks. And I have a hard time saying you should even spend something on Spencer Rattler as it is. So to me, there's really, a very clear top 6 of potential relevance in the NFL, and I would just focus on those guys. And if you're not in a position to land one, that's fine. Just focus on the other positions. Don't go, reaching for somebody that gets drafted in the 4th or 5th round that in all likelihood is just going to ride the bench for a handful of years before they're out of the league. So with that, that concludes this episode of the Dynasty War Room podcast. We are less than 2 weeks away from the NFL draft, so stay tuned for that. Next week, we're going to do a tight end breakdown. That position will probably feature around 7 players, just like today's episode. And then we're just going to jump into the draft. We're going to have, we might have more than one episode following the draft. We'll be there in person, and we'll have a rankings episode, just reactions from the draft, and how you should be approaching your first round, whether it be just, giving a 1 through 12 and where you want to maneuver trade-wise. But so stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you all for listening. I appreciate it, and we will talk to you all next week.